Now, overtourism is not a word that we like to use in Scotland. It tends to be a rather blunt definition for an issue which has multiple challenges and multiple problems. So we are really wanting to talk about our approach to the term overtourism. However, I think it's only going to increase, and I think more and more we're seeing destinations that are starting to struggle with too many visitors, in inverted commas. So today, rather than looking at the big cities, we thought we would bring two examples of two island communities in Scotland, Skye and Orkney. And the two representatives that we have here today are both from destination groups. So they are industry representatives representing their communities, but also their tourism industry. We also hoped to have Sheila Gilmore from Visit Arran, a third island, and unfortunately she can't make it. However, we can have a little bit more time with Shirley and Cameron instead. So, sorry about that. So, tourism in Scotland is an important sector. It's one of the Scottish Government's key economic sectors. So as a result, there has been a real focus on it over the last 5 to 10 years. It employs 1 in 9 people in Scotland, and it's 4.5% of GDP. So it is seen as a real economic driver. As you will all be aware, in rural communities, tourism is probably even more important, particularly in providing jobs, but also in sustaining local services, and Orkney and Skye are certainly no different in that sense. At a national level, the Scottish Tourism Alliance, who I work for, we've taken ownership of the National Tourism Strategy, and we work closely with the 30 destination groups that we have in Scotland, all of which have a strategy that they follow and which feeds into the national approach. And as a result of that, we're able to look across the country and see the challenges coming through as they arise. Orkney and Skye have both been in the news this summer with documentaries, news articles, social media highlighting the difficulties or the challenges of there being too many people on these islands. And I think the thing for us is to think, what are the causes of these problems? Are they the same? And I would suggest they're not. And what are the solutions? We're very much in our journey. We haven't got to the end of it. We haven't solved it yet. But I hope you'll find these two examples are an interesting approach to how a rural community deals with overtourism. So first up, I'd like to introduce Cameron Taylor. Cameron is representing the Orkney Tourism Group. He's got a long background in tourism, tourism development and tourism strategy. And over to you.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Caroline. By a long history of involvement in tourism, she means, of course, that I've gone grey during the process. So let's spend a few minutes talking about Orkney. And let's first of all set Orkney in context. Orkney, described by one of our local authors as beside the oceans of time. If you go to the north of Scotland and keep on going, Orkney is a small group of 16 inhabited islands with a population of about 21,000 people. It's probably about half the number of people who come to the world travel market as the entire population of the islands. Parts of the island have got World Heritage status. So our tourism is very much cultural and heritage and archaeology based, as well as natural heritage. Just over 121,000 overnight visitors each year, complemented by just over 124,000 volume visitors each year. That's visitors who travel in groups, most of them just for the day. The volume side of our tourism sector has grown rapidly over the past few years, particularly cruise industry. It's grown extremely rapidly. Some facts and figures about that. This year there were 95,000 cruise ship passengers. So bear in mind that's a population of 21,000 people swollen by that number of visitors for the day. That 95,000 this year compares to 36,000 in 2011. So that's been the growth. That's huge growth in volume. More than half, substantially more than half of those people will visit the World Heritage Sites because that's why they come. So there's 5,000-year-old, very fragile sites. That's the reason why those people come to Orkney, so they want to visit, and that poses challenges in itself. For 2018, we've got 148 cruise liners already booked, and for 2019, there's almost 100 booked already. So it's a big market and a growing market. And that growth has been driven in part by our harbours department. Our local council operates the harbour. And the cruise sector has grown to the point that Orkney can now claim to be the cruise capital of the UK in terms of the number of passengers. So it's a tiny wee island atop of the north of Scotland with a significant and a growing cruise sector. And that brings problems. There are positives and negatives in terms of impact. The positive impacts, the growth of the cruise sector has created jobs for tour guides, for coach drivers, for people who work in restaurants, for people who do the meet and greet activity. So it creates jobs, and jobs are important for a rural, for an island community. Secondly, it provides income to the harbours department of our local council, which earned this past year somewhere in the excess of £2 million in revenue from visiting cruise liners. So that's a significant chunk of money coming into the coffers of a hard-pressed local authority. And a third positive is many of these 95,000 people who came to Orkney this year as part of quite large groups have expressed a desire to come back. There was too much to see in a day. I want to come back and spend time looking at X, Y, and Z. So it's a driver of return tourism. And those are all good, positive things. On the negative side, 95,000 people all wanting to go to the same place in a short period creates congestion. Creates congestion at individual sites and on the roads and in the shops. And at its most basic, that's 95,000 people who would like to use the washroom. And we're a small community. We don't have that many washrooms, and that creates problems infrastructure-wise. So congestion, it also causes conflict. It causes conflict, I don't mean physical conflict, but bad feeling between visitors who are only there for a day and visitors who are there on a several-night holiday, people who've chosen to spend a holiday there. The overnight visitors resent the fact that there are so many day visitors. We had an unfortunate situation a couple of years ago where an unguided group of cruise liner visitors decided they wanted to take selfies during a funeral in our local cathedral. And that created conflict with the local community. So there are various sources of conflict in the growth of volume tourism. There's also environmental damage. All of those people walking over fragile sites begins to wear those sites out. So the sites themselves can degrade. There's an environmental disbenefit. And an impact on overnight visitors, some of whom are deterred from visiting the islands because they think it's just going to be too busy. So you can be a victim of your own success. And there have been various critics of the growth of volume tourism. First of all, overnight visitors, as I say, they resent day visitors. Accommodation businesses are not particularly impressed by the growth of day visit business because, by definition, they're only visiting for a day. What's in it for the accommodation business? The main town in Orkney is called Kirkwall, and some of the residents in Kirkwall began to resent the growth of volume tourism. The largest ship this year disgorged somewhere around 4,000 passengers who all came into the town at roughly the same time. And that has a huge impact if you're trying to go to the shops, trying to go to the store locally, and the streets are crowded with tourists. Potential visitors, some of them are put off by the fact that we're perceived as being very busy. It makes a fabulous story for the press, and we've had some mischief making by our colleagues in the press, including by the Times, which ought to know better. So I'm happy to name check the Times for making mischief with what they consider to be stresses in a community. Cruise hordes shatter the peace on Orkney. That's not objective reporting. And latterly, tourism and community agencies also began to get just a bit concerned that we've spent years trying to build a volume tourism market, but we'd forgotten to manage that success. So we had marketed, but we hadn't done the visitor management bit. So the response to that, a few points to make about that. First of all, managing that success, first of all, there was a need to recognise the problems and to be honest about the problems. Secondly, to research the actual issues. A number of the views, the disagreements, the perceptions of volume tourism were driven by misinformation. People didn't actually know what the real situation was. And in the absence of facts, people will invent whatever they want. So there was a need for research, and there was a need to discuss the solutions. Not just to say, well, eventually the cruise sector will go away, eventually the volume market will go elsewhere. There was a need to discuss the solutions and to do that in an all-industry way. The cruise sector, the volume sector of tourism, is as much the part of the tourism industry as overnight visitors. It's all part of a tourism industry. So the response to it had to be an all-industry response, with a focus very much on visitor management. Nobody wanted to say, okay, volume tourism, we don't want it anymore. Do not come, we're closed for business. That's such a negative message to put out. And it also, if you say, no, 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 we don't want this aspect of tourism, you're denying local people the potential to gain benefit from that part of the industry. But it did need better management. So the focus for us as a community now has moved from marketing, has moved from constantly saying more, come and visit, to being much more balanced, more, but let's manage that success. And out of that has come the concept of Destination Orkney, which is a destination management and marketing partnership. And looking to the future for that partnership, from where we are today, we're about to recruit a Destination Orkney chief executive, so that will be an individual who has a responsibility to manage that success. Not simply to say, come and visit, more, but for that individual to work with partner agencies to manage that success and to have a visitor management plan. At present, we don't have a visitor management plan. 250,000 visitors, and we don't have a plan for what to do with them, isn't all that clever, really. It sort of needs a plan. And I'm sorry to be basic about it, we've begun to come up with some innovative solutions to toilet provision. You can't just build sufficient toilets for 95,000 people, but what you can do is open community facilities, encourage businesses to offer those sorts of facilities, and try and turn a major problem into something more of an opportunity. In terms of where we see the volume tourism sector going, and the cruise sector in particular, the trends we see are on the one hand bigger ships. Cruise companies are building bigger ships. On the other hand, the trend we're seeing with the passengers is the passengers are looking to be part of smaller groups. So instead of coach loads of people in the future, we're looking more at minibus loads of people, which is great because a minibus load of people is easier to manage, doesn't have as much environmental impact, and it's easier to disperse that. Because that's the other response to this, is rather than constantly market the World Heritage sites, is to begin to say to the market, look, there are these World Heritage sites, there's also an awful lot more. So to try and disperse visitors geographically, to make sure that there's less site-specific over-tourism, so the visitor volume is distributed over the islands and also distributed over time. Tourism in Orkney is very seasonal. It's a July, August, September, maybe June, July, August, September. It's a very, very seasonal industry. And the more that we can encourage visitors to come outside that main season, the more that we're dispersing the demand and the impact on individual sites. So our view as a community is it's about a partnership response to it. It's about not getting dragged into an inflammatory press, oh my God, the world's going to end. These people are evil and awful. It's about a realistic appraisal of the impact of tourism, a realistic appraisal of the impact of over-tourism, and doing something about it as a community and managing that success. Professor Goodwin came to a tourism summit we organised in spring this year. And he used a phrase which resonated very, very strongly with the audience, which was that you either use tourism or you're used by it. And for us as an island community, that resonated very strongly. And what we're doing is responding to that challenge that Professor Goodwin set in March this year, and we're determined to use tourism for the benefit of the community and certainly not to be used by it. Thank you very much. That is me.
Right. Moving swiftly on to a different island, this time off the west coast of Scotland. Skye is perhaps the most famous of all Scottish islands, made famous from the Skye boat song, and has some incredibly dramatic, iconic scenery. It has a population of 10,000, so half the population of Orkney, and is a very large island, probably one of our largest that we have. In 1995, it was joined to the mainland by the Skye Road Bridge. So I will just leave you with that thought and introduce Shirley Spear. Shirley is heading up a new destination group called Skye Connect, so I'll let her tell you a little bit about it.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm here because I'm representing Skye Connect. This is a new destination management organisation established for the Isle of Skye very recently. It's taken us a long time to get there, but we're there at the end. And Skye is situated just off the north coast of Scotland. And in my normal life, my husband Eddie and I own a 5-star restaurant with rooms. It's quite a small business, but it is world renowned. And I'm very proud to say it was named the UK Restaurant of the Year for 2018, despite its remoteness. I was head chef for 21 years and retiring from the stoves due to old age and wilting agility. But we will maintain daily contact with our team in Skye, and we're heavily involved in running the business. So, as Caroline said, Skye is the largest of the Inner Hebrides. Sorry, that's the Three Chimneys. Skye is the largest of the Inner Hebrides. They stretch all the way down the west coast of Scotland. No. They stretch all the way down the west coast of Scotland, and combined together with the outer Hebridean archipelago, which stretches from Lewis to Barra, further west into the Atlantic Ocean. The Hebrides are often referred to as the Western Isles and have been described by many fine writers and poets over the generations, including those using the indigenous Gaelic language. My favourite is a description of the islands likened to a handful of jewels which have been remotely scattered into the sea. This is very apt indeed, as each island is very different from all the others. Each island has its own distinct charm and character, and the landscapes vary tremendously. Even the Gaelic language is spoken in different dialects, making it all the more confusing to learn. And this ensures that an exploratory tour of a spectacular region is always full of interest, adventures and brand new experiences. Between Skye and the Outer Hebrides is a stretch of water known as the Minch, which protects Skye's coastline from the more serious ravages of the Atlantic Ocean. Long, empty, white sandy beaches are scarce in Skye compared with the beautiful beaches associated with the Outer Hebrides, but like every wonderful place on the planet, if you have local knowledge of where to find the best spots, then beautiful beaches can be found. They're mostly a fine mix of black sand, as Skye is dominated by the Kulin Mountains, a spectacular ridge of extinct volcanic rock. Ancient glacial activity has formed many wonderful mountain glens which sweep down to the sea. There are numerous lochans and waterfalls, deep pools and mountain burns. The edges of the island can rise to some of the steepest cliffs in the whole of Europe, creating amazing seascapes and cliff-top paths. At the north end, in the Trotternish region, are outstanding rock formations comprising some of the oldest rocks on Earth and forming truly unique geological sites of world-class importance, which are totally unprotected. Needless to say, the wildlife in Skye is wonderful too, home to golden eagles and even larger white-tailed sea eagles and many other species of seabirds. The seas which surround the rocky shores are very clean and crystal clear, home to many once-in-a-lifetime sights such as our seal colonies, dancing dolphins, basking sharks and migrating whales. There's something very special about every season. Wildflowers abound from early spring until late autumn. There are wide stretches of heather moorland and farmland, and it's not obvious that it's farmland as cultivation happens in small, very individual crofts, a small holding owned by one family. They might keep a flock of sheep, or perhaps cows, some hens and maybe a pig, or a goat. This means that the supplies of local fresh meat are outstanding, as is the island, as is the wild venison from the hills. Shellfish caught off the shores is of superb quality. All of this fishing and farming is very low-key and sustainable, similar in many ways to what it has been for generations of local families who live on these island communities. It means our local food and drink is also exceptionally special and worth a visit on its own merit. But every island community needs a tourism industry to boost its economy and make the small businesses which provide essentials for all those who live there viable all year round. If tourism was not part and parcel of everyday life, the population of the islands would have dwindled even further than it has done since the 1950s. We have a big challenge to interest our young people in staying on the islands to participate in career development at home, far from the madding crowds which attract them, naturally, to the bright lights of the city and London. In recent years, many small landowners have sold housing sites for good profits, enabling well-heeled incomers to buy and build a brand new house and retire to a quieter lifestyle. This is welcome on one hand, but it has also had a detrimental effect upon the availability of affordable housing for our young people. This, plus the dramatic rise in the number of self-catering and Airbnb properties on the island, has made a tangible difference to business recruitment and retention. Skye is no different from other areas of Europe, indeed the world, which is experiencing very similar changes in small places and large. Public transport is also scarce and expensive in rural areas, just as it's become more and more onerous for young people to afford the down payment on a car, plus the insurance, let alone the cost of learning to drive. Our mobile phone connectivity is really poor, and as for superfast broadband, well, this is a major issue for us on Skye and in some other rural areas of Scotland. In short, not a great deal has improved by way of the infrastructure of the island's roads, transport and communication, since I moved to Skye in October 1984, a little over 33 years ago. Compare that to what's happened in London in the past 33 years. Although we've invested in our own business and developed to become a renowned world-class destination in our own right, this has been without a great deal of real backup support from our UK or Scottish Government, nor our public agencies. As a small rural business in a remote area, I feel we have risen to their challenge of growing our business to deliver a high-quality experience of the very best kind. However, the infrastructure that surrounds us is no longer fit for purpose and needs major investment, which has been shamefully ignored for far too long. There is now an enormous job and very little money to tackle it. The cost of running a business in the Scottish Islands is high. We're remote, but we are exceptionally busy, an increasingly popular destination for almost the whole year round. As a high-end restaurant, our trading pattern is very different from a city centre restaurant, being buoyant every day of the week for both lunch and dinner. We achieve virtually 100% occupation in our accommodation. Earlier this year, small businesses like my own were suddenly delivered notice of an enormous hike in our business rates. In our case, it was over 400% in one fell swoop. Due to the high level of protests from the whole hospitality sector in Scotland, the Scottish Government decided to cap the business rates for 1 year. However, there has been no further information about what the future will hold. I feel very strongly that we're expected to pay a great deal of money into the public coffers, but we do not achieve anywhere near enough investment for our local infrastructure in return. The same applies to VAT. It is blatantly clear to me and others I work with in tourism and hospitality sector that some radical thinking is required on the part of our government to truly accept that tourism is of vital importance to the economy of our country. For far too long, tourism has been left to get on with the job without receiving the business support it needs. In Scotland, a massive percentage of those involved directly are small businesses, often family-run and dependent upon their property as their home as well as their main source of income. Tourism succeeds because business makes it succeed, because very small business has got to survive. I also feel it's vital for my generation to encourage more and more young people into the industry, as I'm not going to be around for much longer. My time's almost over, but the younger generation must pick up the torch and carry it higher, wider and further for all. They need to accept that the future is no longer the responsibility of my generation, but their own responsibility to develop and grow business for themselves, embracing all the digital changes, the needs and desires of their contemporaries and the generation which will follow soon. Heck. The Skye brand is exceptionally strong. Next to Edinburgh, Skye is the second most sought-after destination in Scotland. Over the past 5 years, the number of visitors finding their way to Skye has risen beyond any expectations. Skye is not easy to reach. We have no airport. The roads are long and winding. It is a beautiful drive, but a testing drive for those who are not used to it. We do have our famous bridge, which links us directly to the mainland. It is also possible to sail over the sea to Skye on one of Caledonian McBrain's ferries, which serve all the Scottish islands, or on the small private ferry from Glenelg. But on the island itself, there are mainly single-track roads with passing places, and these are something new to negotiate for most people who suddenly find themselves driving a strange vehicle on the wrong side of the road. But all of these things are special characteristics to Skye, and we don't want to change them. Skye has been no different from any other area of Scotland this summer, which has experienced an additional number of visitors. But Skye seems to have stolen the show in the press. There are tales of being no room in Skye, have been around for donkey's years, but this year there were additional sensational headlines in the papers about the police turning people away at the bridge and traffic at a standstill. But did Skye need to introduce a tourism tax? Did Skye need to charge everyone coming across the bridge? So the answer to all of these stories and statements was no, no, and no again. In fact, many outright lies were told in the press, emboldened by sensational headlines. This was the silly summer season gone mad. No matter how much we tried to counteract the stories, these were repeated over and over again. Meanwhile, all of us in Skye were getting on with the day job. We were welcoming visitors, keeping them informed, and making them feel at home. Despite the headlines, there were actually very few complaints from the people who were actually there and enjoying the spectacular sights. The roads were not at a standstill, and although in the height of August it's difficult to get last-minute accommodation or a late table, there was none of the despair described by journalists. Yes, we have trouble spots, 5 iconic sites which everyone seems to converge upon these days. All of these are on a single track road with passing places, but they have inadequate parking and no toilets. Okay, well, we all know that social media, instant photographic experiences are spreading like wildfire around the world in seconds. Plus, the TV, film and pop video world have turned our beauty spots into some of the most recognised locations on the planet. And no matter how remote and inaccessible these may be, people of all ages are hell-bent on getting there. This is wonderful on one hand, but disastrous on the other, as so many of our Scottish attractions are wild and remote. Their wildness is what has made them attractive in the first place. So it's with a heavy heart we are now finding ourselves coping with traffic jams, small but people let loose on the road who don't even know how to drive the vehicles some of them are driving. And small bus tours are largely responsible for the increase in numbers and heavier traffic, with motorhomes coming a close second. So this has caused a lot of tension within the community, just as Cameron said. Footpaths have been heavily eroded, road verges are broken and deeply rutted. These need repair and a lot of money. The balance has got to be put right. And much more than this, we need to keep it on an even keel. We need well-planned strategies for dealing with the changes that modern travellers expect and demand, whilst retaining our local individuality and great charm, which they all love to experience. So, Skye's not turning into a theme park. This is just one beauty spot of hundreds and hundreds you can explore. And there's so many wonderful activities that you can do alone or in groups. So as the sun sets on another spectacular year for Skye, we all have a responsibility for ensuring that the beauty of our wonderful places is kept that way for future generations, to marvel at and enjoy at its best and most prized. Tourism is all about beauty. It's not about a selfish beast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirley, and I apologise for having to bing the bell. I've been told that I needed to do it to keep everybody on time. So we've got just over 5 minutes, so rather than me asking questions of the panel, has anybody got a question that they would like to ask? Benjamin.
Hi, my name's Benjamin Carey. Recently, the Scottish Government has announced £6 million of funding to improve tourism infrastructure in places. If Skye was to get all 6 million, what would you spend it on?
6 million. Can you hear me?
Yes.
6 million is a drop in the ocean. The 6 million is to be spread over 2 years in the whole of Scotland. We could spend 6 million in one day just looking at some of the problems that we have to deal with. We had the Minister for Tourism, the Cabinet Secretary for Tourism was in Skye on Friday. It was a whisk in and whisk out box ticking exercise, unfortunately. Lots of questions and comments from the floor from our community and very little answered. So we have a long, long way to go, and the 6 million was just a bit of spin.
Shirley, if I could just follow up on Benjamin's question. If I was the Scottish Minister of Tourism, Where would you think that £6 million should come from?
The £6 million? Right, okay. You asked me. My husband and I have a tiny business with 6 bedrooms and a 38 cover restaurant. We've just paid our third quarter of VAT, which amounts to thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds. That's one business in that very remote corner of Scotland, achieving all that money. Where does it all go? We do not get our just returns. 20% is charged on every bill in the UK as a VAT. If in many other European countries the VAT rate is much lower, but you do put on a small tourism tax instead. I would like to see the VAT cut in half for tourism in Scotland, and perhaps everyone paying an additional tourism tax, as long as that money goes into tourism and especially kept for funding the infrastructure projects that we so hugely need.
Cameron, do you have a view on this?
A couple of views, I think. First of all, I wouldn't spend all £6 million in Skye. I might spend 3 million of it in Orkney and 3 million in Skye.
There are other places in Scotland, you know.
Yeah, I can think of a few that would quite like to get their hands on it as well.
Yeah, well, they can't. We've already spent
Hold
it. We've already spent that money, so it's too late. Tourist tax is a difficult issue. There is an argument that says the people causing the problem ought to help solve the problem. It's a debate that we've had in Orkney about cruise liners. Should cruise liner passengers perhaps pay an additional levy for coming to Orkney, not to penalise them for visiting, but so that they can be responsible tourists and start to bear part of the cost of the disbenefits that they create. So there are arguments for visitor levies, either obligatory ones or voluntary ones. Our colleague from Arran, who isn't here today, introduced a voluntary levy for visitors. They set up a trust. Visitors who enjoyed their visit, wanted to contribute to the maintenance of the environment there, were able to put money into the trust, and they've generated some revenue from that. Ultimately, I think, though, government, and it echoes Shirley's point, government makes quite a lot of tax revenue from tourism. It's a real industry like any other, and government ought to invest in the success of tourism.
I think also so much of the investment is needed in the infrastructure, which is not just used by tourism, but is used by everybody. And that's where the challenge is coming. It's certainly quite a live debate in Scotland is who pays? Who is it who is paying for these facilities that we're all using? And certainly the tourism tax word is a very hot topic in Scotland at the moment. You can imagine the different sides of the debate. Perhaps time for just one last question. Lady at the back. Thank you, Harold.
Both Cameron and Shelley talked about media reports that are sensationalistic or mischievous when covering over-tourism. How would you suggest that journalists with limited time become more responsible in their coverage?
Good question. Very good question. Over to you, Cameron. Are you going to dance?
I'll even stand up in order to answer that. Most journalists are very responsible and are working to tight deadlines and try to reflect a story fairly. I think any journalist who writes a story without talking to local people and respecting the spread of opinion in a community is doing that community a disservice. I hate to name check the Times again, but they didn't reflect the debate that was going on in the community fairly. They jumped at the opportunity for a sensationalist headline, which sold newspapers. And even The Guardian followed suit and wrote something that wasn't quite so well written as the Times piece. But it's too easy to do, it's too easy to sensationalise. And it's difficult for us as a community to get the more nuanced, the balanced story out. But bad reporting just inflames local debate as well. It's a bad thing.
Certainly, there was a piece in The Guardian on Friday, I think, Shirley, about a meeting that was taking place looking at the issue of over-tourism on Skye. There's been a lot of very negative press on Skye over the summer, and some of it kind of pretty vicious in some places.
Yeah, it certainly has been, and I've had to. It's been even more vicious when you're the person they come and ask for comments, and you try and give them as much fair comment and really good down-to-earth information as possible, most of which is ignored, and then the final piece is heavily edited. They slap a huge photograph in there, and a headline writer writes the headlines, which has had, and he's had nothing, or he or she has had nothing to do with the person who came to interview you in the first place. So it's been awful, because Skye is the big brand name that everybody knows and recognises. Skye's had it absolutely in the neck all summer. I think I've been dealing with the press since June, even when I was away on my own holiday, and it hasn't gone away, and it's not stopping, and now I'm not making myself available to make comment now because it's almost contradictory. So it has been really difficult, and it has been irresponsible, and it has inflamed issues for our local community enormously, and has made it very difficult. There are a lot of people who are anti-tourism now, even although they depend on it for their own income, or both directly or indirectly. I don't believe there's anyone who lives on the islands who isn't affected indirectly by the income and the economy support that comes from tourism. So it is a sad issue and a very difficult one. But the whole of Scotland has suffered the same sort of problems that we've been dealing with ourselves, because local councils who are responsible for things like the maintenance of roads, the maintenance and provision of public toilets, are so cash-strapped at the moment due to all the austerity measures that have happened in the UK recently, that they just claim there is no money and they have no budget. So, but as Cameron mentioned, the cruise ships are coming into our local harbours. Our local harbours are owned and run by the council, so they are actually acquiring quite a lot of money from berthing fees. And where's that money going? We're not seeing the return for the money that is being earned from tourism going back into our country.
Thank you, Shirley, that's great.